It was the second Tuesday of March, 1980, when 24-year-old Ruth Calloway stood at the rail of the Somerset County sale barn in western Wisconsin, watching 6 Milking Devon cows that nobody else in the building wanted to bid on. They were small animals, deep red-brown and heavy-horned, built more like the working oxen their breed had descended from than like the sleek black-and-white Holsteins filling every other pen in that barn that morning. Their bags hung modest and tight, nothing like the swollen udders of the Holstein herd 2 pens over that had just sold for top dollar not 20 minutes earlier. An auctioneer named Delbert Rausch had already run through the lot twice trying to find a single opening bid, and both times the barn had gone quiet, except for the low murmur of men who'd already decided the animals weren't worth the hay it would take to winter them. Ruth raised her hand at $11 a head. The laughter that followed was the easy, comfortable kind, the kind that comes from men who already believe they know something and enjoy knowing it in front of someone who apparently doesn't. Gerald Stanhope, who ran 300 head of registered Holstein on the largest dairy operation in the county, leaned toward the man standing beside him at the rail and said something behind his hand that made the man's shoulders shake. It traveled down the row the way those things always traveled in a small sale barn, quiet and complete, until most of the building had heard some version of it before the gavel ever came down on Ruth's bid. Ruth heard it too. She had the particular quality of a woman who heard everything and answered very little. She was slight but strong through the shoulders from 4 years of hauling feed and hay bales on her family's 40 acres, sun-browned skin, dark hair kept short and practical under a canvas cap, hands already calloused in the particular way a woman's hands go when milking becomes daily work rather than a chore shared among many hands. She had grown up on that land, the only child of a man who'd milked Holsteins his entire working life and never once questioned whether there was another way to do it, until arthritis took the strength out of his hands 2 winters back and left the milking almost entirely to Ruth. She was the one who found the Devon herd listed in the back pages of a farm dispersal bulletin her grandmother subscribed to that winter. 6 cows and a young bull coming off an estate sale 2 counties over, the previous owner having died without children interested in keeping cattle that didn't fit the modern dairy program anymore. Ruth had driven up to see them the week before the auction, walked among them for the better part of an hour in a muddy March pasture without saying much, watching how they moved, how they grazed contentedly on rough forage that the Holsteins back home would have picked through and mostly left behind. She had called her grandmother from the payphone outside the feed store that same afternoon. "They're small," she'd said, "but there's something in the milk. I want to test it before I decide anything." Her grandmother, Opal Calloway, had lived on that farm for 61 years and milked cows by hand for the better part of 3 decades before anyone in the family ever owned a milking machine. She didn't ask many questions when Ruth explained what she was thinking. She only said, "Bring a jar home. I'll know what I'm tasting the second it touches my tongue." Ruth had come home that evening with a mason jar of Devon milk, and her grandmother had held it up to the kitchen window light, studied its color for a long moment, then gone quiet, in the particular way she went quiet whenever she was turning something over in her mind that she wasn't ready to say out loud just yet. What Ruth understood, standing at that sale barn in March, raising her hand for $11 a head while Gerald Stanhope laughed behind his, was something most of Somerset County had stopped thinking about the moment Holstein herds took over nearly every dairy operation in the state after the war. A Holstein cow could produce 2, sometimes nearly 3 times the volume of milk a Devon cow gave in a single day. That fact, which Gerald Stanhope considered the only fact worth knowing, was in Ruth's accounting only half of the story. Holstein milk ran thin, low in butterfat, bred over 4 decades specifically for volume, to feed a post-war market that paid by the gallon and asked very little about what was actually in it. Devon milk ran in the opposite direction entirely, dense with butterfat, the kind of rich, old-fashioned milk that cheesemakers a generation earlier had prized above nearly everything else before the dairy industry rebuilt itself around volume instead of quality. Ruth had spent the better part of that winter reading through her grandmother's old dairy bulletins and a handful of newer trade publications Opal still received by mail, and she had come to understand that somewhere out past the edges of Somerset County, a small but slowly growing handful of specialty cheese-making operations were beginning to pay real premiums for exactly the kind of high butterfat milk a Holstein herd could never produce, no matter how many gallons it gave. She didn't explain any of that to Gerald Stanhope. She didn't explain it to anyone standing at that rail. She simply paid her $11 a head, 6 times over, signed the bill of sale with Delbert Roush, and loaded the Devons into her father's borrowed stock trailer while the laughter was still settling into the rafters behind her. Gerald Stanhope came by the farm 3 days later. He drove up in a truck that cost more than Ruth's entire herd combined, parked it at the edge of the drive, and leaned against her fence rail with the easy confidence of a man paying a friendly visit while also intending to deliver a lesson. He was a big man, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a face gone permanently pink from 30 years of standing bareheaded in the sun at sale barns, sunburn layered over sunburn until it had simply become his natural color. He wore a clean, pressed shirt, even out to a farm, the kind of man who dressed for the impression he intended to leave rather than the work in front of him. 6 head, he said, looking past Ruth toward the pasture where the Devons stood grazing near the tree line. Devons. He said the word the way a man says something that already carries its own verdict. That's right, Ruth said. Now, Ruth, I'm not here to tell you your business. He turned his hat over once in his hands, searching for the charitable phrasing. But those animals, they're not going to perform the way they need to perform on a real dairy operation. Not for what the co-op's paying per hundredweight these days. You need volume. What you've got standing in that field is a museum piece with horns. Ruth's father had come out onto the porch by then, standing quietly with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Ruth didn't look at him. She looked at Gerald Stanhope steadily. I appreciate you stopping by, Gerald, Ruth said. I'm just saying, as a neighbor. He settled his hat back on his head. You paid good money for a problem is all I'm saying. He drove off down the gravel road, trailing a plume of white dust behind him. Ruth watched him go, then turned back toward the pasture and went on with the evening milking. That evening, the phone rang 2 more times. First, a man named Curtis Holloway, who ran feed sales out of the co-op and had heard about the Devons from Gerald at the diner that afternoon, calling under the pretense of asking whether Ruth needed anything special ordered for them little cows. Then a call from a woman 2 farms over, whom Ruth barely knew, asking with poorly disguised curiosity how the new herd was settling in the particular tone of someone who already believed she knew the answer. By the end of the week, the story of Ruth Calloway's $11 Devons had made its full circuit through Somerset County and arrived at the general conclusion that she was either naive or stubborn, and probably both. She was neither. She was simply quiet about what she knew, in the way people are quiet when they understand that explaining themselves to the wrong audience is a waste of time better spent on the actual work. Now, let me tell you something about the Milking Devon that most of Somerset County, Wisconsin, in the spring of 1980 had long since forgotten, if they had ever known it at all. The Devon breed traces its ancestry back to the red cattle of Devonshire in southwestern England, animals bred for centuries to be equally useful pulling a plow, fattening for beef, and producing milk. A triple-purpose animal in an era before industrial agriculture decided that specialization was the only path to efficiency. Devons had come to America with some of the earliest English settlers, working the rocky, difficult soil of New England for 2 centuries before larger, more specialized breeds gradually replaced them on most working farms. What survived into the 20th century as dedicated dairy Devon lines had been bred, generation after generation, not for volume, but for the richness of what they produced. A butterfat content that could run nearly a full percentage point higher than a typical Holstein, sometimes more. That difference, which sounded small stated as a bare number, was in practice enormous to anyone making cheese or butter rather than bottling fluid milk for a grocery shelf. A pound of butter, a wheel of cheese, required a fixed amount of butterfat regardless of how much liquid milk it took to get there. A gallon of Holstein milk might yield a certain weight of cheese only with a large volume of milk and considerable processing. The same weight of cheese from Devon milk required meaningfully less milk to start with, translating directly into lower costs and, more importantly, to the growing handful of small cheesemakers just beginning to build reputations for quality over quantity, a noticeably richer, more complex finished product. Devons were also, as a breed, remarkably efficient on rough forage, capable of maintaining good body condition and steady milk production on pasture and hay that a high-producing Holstein would need heavy grain supplementation to match. On Ruth's 40 acres, much of it hillside pasture too steep and rocky for row crops, that efficiency mattered enormously. Where a Holstein herd of comparable size might have required expensive purchased grain to maintain production through a Wisconsin winter, the Devons held steady condition on hay Ruth grew herself and the rough browse along her fence lines that the Holsteins down the road would have ignored entirely. Ruth had read all of this in her grandmother's bulletins over the winter, underlining passages in pencil at the kitchen table some nights until well past midnight. But she hadn't bought the herd because of what she'd read. She'd bought them because of what she'd seen in that muddy pasture 2 counties over. The quality of their coats, the steadiness of their movement across rough ground, the particular calm alertness in their eyes that told her these were animals built for something other than what everyone around her had decided cattle were supposed to be built for. She began, that spring, testing her theory in the most direct way she knew how. She drove 2 hours south to a small cheese-making operation outside Monroe, Wisconsin that she'd read about in one of Opal's trade bulletins, a husband and wife operation named Voss Family Creamery that had been quietly building a reputation for traditional-style aged cheeses among a small circle of specialty grocers in Madison and Milwaukee. She brought 2 gallons of Devon milk packed in ice in the bed of her truck and asked, without much preamble, whether they'd be willing to test it. Daniel Voss, the cheesemaker, was skeptical at first, the way most professionals are skeptical of an unannounced 24-year-old showing up with milk in a cooler. But he tested it anyway, running the standard butterfat measurement in front of her, and went quiet himself when the number came back nearly a full 1.5 points above what he typically received from his usual Holstein suppliers. "Where'd you get cows that test like this?" he asked her. "Bought them at auction. Nobody else wanted them." Daniel Voss looked at her for a long moment, then looked back down at the numbers on his testing sheet and told her that if she could deliver consistent quantities of milk testing anywhere near what she'd brought him that day, he'd take every gallon she could produce, and he'd pay a premium well above what the regional co-op was offering for standard grade A fluid milk. It wasn't a fortune. 6 cows produced a modest amount of milk compared to Gerald Stanhope's 300 head, but it was real money, tied to quality rather than volume, and it was the first outside confirmation Ruth had that what she'd seen in that muddy pasture wasn't simply stubbornness dressed up as vision. Through that spring and into summer, Ruth built her small herd's routine around the specific things Devons needed to thrive. She kept them on rotational pasture, moving them through smaller paddocks every few days rather than letting them range over the whole property at once, a practice her grandmother remembered before the war and had mostly fallen out of favor once larger operations found it easier to simply feed more grain than manage pasture passively. She hand-selected which hayfields to cut first based on which grew the richest mix of clover and native grasses, understanding that what the cows ate directly shaped what came out in the milk testing at Voss Family Creamery each week. By August, her small herd was producing consistently, the butterfat numbers holding steady at levels that continued to surprise Daniel Voss every time a new batch came in. She had begun making the 2-hour drive to Monroe every 10 days, her truck bed loaded with milk cans packed in ice, the arrangement steady enough now that Daniel had started setting aside a standing order for her before she even arrived. Gerald Stanhope, meanwhile, was having a difficult summer of his own, not the kind anyone in Somerset County could have predicted back in March. The regional dairy co-op that purchased the bulk of the county's Holstein milk had spent the previous 2 years absorbing falling prices as the national market for standard fluid milk grew increasingly oversupplied, a slow-moving crisis that farmers with large Holstein operations felt most acutely, since their entire business model depended on selling enormous volumes at whatever price the co-op happened to be offering that month. By midsummer, the co-op announced a further price cut per hundredweight, the third in 18 months, and Gerald Stanhope, along with most of the large dairy operations in the county, found his margins thinner than they'd been in a decade. Ruth's arrangement with Voss Family Creamery, by contrast, wasn't tied to the co-op's fluctuating price at all. It was a direct premium contract based on quality, insulated from the volume-driven collapse squeezing every large Holstein operation in the region. In September, a reporter from a regional farm trade publication out of Madison drove out to Voss Family Creamery to write a feature on the small but growing specialty cheese movement taking hold across southern Wisconsin. Farmers and cheesemakers experimenting with older breeds and traditional methods as an alternative to the increasingly difficult economics of large-scale commodity dairy. Daniel Voss mentioned Ruth's Devon herd during the interview, almost in passing, and the reporter drove the additional 2 hours north to Somerset County to see it for herself. The article ran in October under a modest headline about the return of heritage dairy breeds, featuring a photograph of Ruth standing at her fence line among the Devons, and it caught the attention of exactly the kind of reader the piece was written for. A handful of specialty grocers and restaurant buyers across the upper Midwest who had begun actively seeking out exactly the sort of quality-focused, small-batch dairy product that Ruth's herd was quietly producing. By November, Ruth had 2 additional cheesemakers reaching out directly, both offering standing contracts for whatever milk she could supply beyond her existing arrangement with Voss Family Creamery. She didn't have the herd size to meet all of it. She had 6 cows. That winter, Ruth drove out to a dispersal sale in the next county over, this one drawing considerably less laughter than her first purchase had, and came home with 4 more Milking Devon heifers, young animals from a small remaining line a retired dairyman had kept going almost as a hobby after most of the industry had moved on entirely to Holsteins. Gerald Stanhope stopped by the farm again that December, on a Saturday afternoon with an early snow just beginning to fall. He stood at the same fence rail, watching the now 10-head herd move slowly across a paddock in the thin winter light, their heavy red-brown coats catching what little sun made it through the clouds. "Heard about the Voss contract," he said finally. "That's right," Ruth said. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cattle rather than at her. "I had you wrong," he said, eventually, in the particular tone of a man saying something he'd been carrying for a while and had finally decided the carrying wasn't worth what it cost him anymore. "Turns out I didn't know what year it was." Ruth's father, standing nearby stacking firewood, didn't look up, but he said, "You came by with a spare fuel pump back in June when our truck broke down on the highway. That's what I remember about this year, Gerald." Gerald nodded slowly, looking back at the herd. "Good animals," he said finally. "Not what I'd have bought myself, but good animals." He came back the following spring, this time with 2 younger dairymen from farther down the county who had questions, having heard through the same slow channels of small-town conversation that had once carried mockery, now carrying something closer to genuine curiosity. Ruth walked them through the rotational grazing, the breed selection, the economics of quality over volume, with the same plain, unhurried patience her grandmother had shown her at the kitchen table 2 winters earlier. None of this is new. It's how dairy farming worked before anybody decided bigger was automatically better. It's just not what most people around here have been doing for the last 30 years. They asked questions. She answered them plainly, without any edge of vindication in her voice, and they went home with pages of notes and the names of 2 more small cheesemakers worth calling. By the time Ruth turned 30, 5 years after that March morning at the Somerset County sale barn, her herd had grown to nearly 40 head, supplying 3 separate cheesemaking operations across southern Wisconsin, including Voss Family Creamery, which by then had built a modest but genuine regional reputation, partly on the strength of the rich, high butterfat milk Ruth had been delivering faithfully every 10 days since that first skeptical test in Daniel Voss's kitchen. Her grandmother Opal lived to see all of it, sitting most afternoons on the farmhouse porch with a cup of coffee, watching the Devons move across pasture that once carried only Holsteins, until she passed peacefully in her sleep the winter Ruth turned 34, leaving behind among her things the same mason jar Ruth had first brought her milk home in 14 years earlier, washed and kept on a kitchen shelf the whole time. Decades later, when Ruth's niece Callie took over the herd, growing up watching her aunt move through those same pastures with the same unhurried patience, the operation had grown into one of the most respected small dairy herds in the region, still built around the same 6 cows that once drew laughter at $11 a head on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Callie kept Opal's mason jar on the same kitchen shelf, and kept, too, the same composition notebook Ruth had filled over the years with butterfat readings and pasture rotations, passed down the way some families pass down land, or a name, or a particular way of paying attention to something everyone else has already decided isn't worth the trouble. The Somerset County sale barn is still there, though it changed hands twice since 1980 and mostly handles beef cattle now. Nobody there remembers exactly which Tuesday it was that a young woman raised her hand for $11 a head. But out on the old Calloway place, the herd still grazes the same hillside pasture, red-brown coats catching the same slanted Wisconsin light, proof of something that took decades to fully arrive, but that has lasted considerably longer than the laughter ever did.